5 hours until sunrise. The Pacific is unnervingly calm. From the mouth of the concrete pillbox, the American fleet is a city of dark specters on the water, a silent promise of overwhelming force. Every Nambu machine gun is sighted on the beaches. Every mortar pit is ready. We have prepared for this day for months, turning this small island into a fortress of death. But as the minutes tick away, a single question hangs in the air, unspoken by 1,000 defenders. What kind of man willingly sails into a fortress designed to ensure his annihilation? This question was not born of idle curiosity. It was a cold spike of doubt, hammered into the Japanese military consciousness by years of brutal island-to-island warfare. The answer defied everything they had been told, everything they had been trained to believe about their primary adversary. In the early days of the war, the official portrait of the American fighting man, disseminated from the highest levels of command in Tokyo, was one of contemptuous dismissal. He was, according to the propaganda, a product of a soft, consumerist society. He was an individualist, incapable of the selfless sacrifice that was the bedrock of the Imperial Army. He was a creature of comfort, who loved his jazz music and chocolate bars far more than his country. This caricature was a cornerstone of Japanese strategic planning. It was a comforting belief that their own spiritual superiority, the Yamato Damashi, would inevitably triumph over America's material advantage. The enemy, they were assured, had no stomach for a real fight. Their will would crumble like sun-baked earth at the first sign of determined resistance. The first test of this theory came in August of 1942 in the malarial jungles of an obscure island called Guadalcanal. It was here that the carefully constructed artifice of American weakness was not just challenged, it was violently torn to shreds. The men who stormed ashore were not the pampered civilians from the posters. They were the 1st Marine Division, and they brought with them a brand of warfare the Japanese had never anticipated from an Occidental power. They endured starvation, disease, and relentless counterattacks in the stinking mud of the jungle. They fought with a savage tenacity in nighttime brawls for nameless ridges and died in heaps to defend a dirt airstrip. For the seasoned soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, who had carved an empire across China and Southeast Asia, this was a profound shock. They had expected to sweep the Americans back into the sea. Instead, they found an enemy who met their own ferocity and refused to break. The propaganda was a lie. This pattern would repeat itself with escalating horror across the vast chessboard of the Pacific. At Tarawa Atoll in November of 1943, the Marines waded ashore through a sea of fire into the teeth of one of the most heavily fortified islands on the planet. They suffered thousands of casualties in a matter of hours, a price that, by any conventional military logic, should have broken the assault. But they did not break. They kept coming. They climbed over the bodies of their own comrades to claw their way into the Japanese defenses, fighting with rifles, bayonets, and bare hands. To the Japanese defenders, this was incomprehensible. It was a fighting spirit that seemed to mirror their own code of Bushido, a willingness to die for a patch of ground that defied all Western logic. The American they had been taught to despise was a ghost. In his place stood the United States Marine, a warrior whose motivations were a terrifying enigma. The question echoing in the pre-dawn darkness of the pillbox was no longer rhetorical. Understanding this new enemy was now a matter of survival. To the Japanese soldier, conditioned by a martial tradition that stretched back centuries, the ferocity of the Marine was initially understandable, if shocking. It was a spirit they recognized. But what truly began to unravel their understanding of the enemy was not the spirit itself, but the doctrine that weaponized it. Standard military practice for virtually every army on Earth dictated a rhythm to battle. An assault was a crescendo of violence, followed by a necessary pause, a time to consolidate gains, resupply ammunition, tend to the wounded, and reorganize for the next push. Combat had an ebb and a flow. The United States Marines, however, seemed to operate outside this fundamental law of warfare. They introduced the Japanese to the horrifying concept of the 24-hour offensive. Once the Marines hit the beach, the battle did not stop. Not for darkness, not for exhaustion, not for casualties. They attacked relentlessly, maintaining a level of constant, grinding pressure that was designed to shatter not just defenses, but the minds of the defenders. Night, which the Japanese had long considered their ally and the domain for their most feared infiltration tactics and banzai charges, was turned against them. Marine patrols probed defensive lines in the suffocating darkness, creating a state of perpetual anxiety. Sleep became an unaffordable luxury for the Japanese soldier, replaced by the nerve-shredding tension of waiting for the next attack that could come from any direction, at any moment. This was not random aggression. It was a deliberate and brutal strategy. A Japanese position that repelled a frontal assault at 3 p.m. would find itself hammered by mortars at dusk, probed by infantry at midnight, and assaulted from a new direction at dawn. There was no respite. No chance to repair fortifications, redistribute ammunition, or even eat a full ration. The American Marine Corps had become a human grinding machine, and its single purpose was to move forward. This doctrine was epitomized by a phrase that chilled even the most hardened observers: the willingness to push forward over their own dead. This was not a sign of disrespect for their fallen comrades, but a testament to an almost inhuman focus on the objective. The momentum of the assault was paramount. Pausing to aid the fallen would give the enemy a moment to recover, to zero in their machine guns, to call in their mortars. The terrible calculus of this new warfare dictated that the attack must not stop. The fallen would be recovered later. First, the position had to be taken. This relentless pressure was a psychological weapon of immense power. It took the Japanese strategy of a determined, sacrificial defense and turned it into a slow, agonizing demise. On islands like Saipan and Peleliu in 1944, Japanese defenders who had prepared to die with honor in a single, decisive battle found themselves instead being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, hour by agonizing hour, by an enemy that simply would not quit. The warrior spirit they had encountered at Guadalcanal was now being fueled by a tactical doctrine that was as inexhaustible as the ocean itself. And behind that doctrine lay the true secret to its terrifying effectiveness. That relentless, forward-grinding doctrine was not born in a vacuum. It was powered by a force the Japanese military mind, for all its study of warfare, had never truly comprehended: the full, unadulterated industrial might of the United States of America. The individual Marine, as ferocious as he was merely the tip of a spear whose shaft stretched back thousands of miles to the factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, and the shipyards of California. This was industrial warfare personified, a systematic application of overwhelming firepower that turned Pacific Islands into scientific laboratories of destruction. The process began long before the first landing craft hit the beach. It began with the steel rain. For days on end, Japanese garrisons would endure a naval bombardment of apocalyptic scale. Battleships like the Iowa and New Jersey, with naval guns firing shells the weight of a small automobile, would systematically erase the landscape. These were not mere explosions. They were geological events, pulverizing concrete bunkers, collapsing trench systems, and stripping away every trace of vegetation. To the men huddled deep within the earth, it was a man-made earthquake, a relentless concussion that shattered nerves and instilled a profound sense of helplessness. Once the Marines were ashore, this symphony of destruction only grew more intimate and complex. They brought their own artillery, hundreds of guns that could blanket square kilometers of territory, with a terrifyingly precise deluge of high explosives. Marine artillerymen perfected the art of the time-on-target barrage, where multiple batteries would fire at different timings so that all their shells arrived on a single target at the exact same instant. For the Japanese soldiers caught in such a barrage, there was nowhere to hide. The world simply erupted around them. The sky, too, belonged to the Americans. Flights of Corsair and Hellcat fighter bombers circled overhead like birds of prey, acting as the personal artillery of the ground troops. A Marine lieutenant pinned down by a stubborn machine gun nest could get on his radio and, minutes later, watch a bomb or a volley of rockets obliterate the position. This created a terrifyingly three-dimensional battlefield from which there was no escape. But it was on the ground, in the face-to-face struggle for every cave and pillbox, that the most visceral tools of this industrial war were unleashed. Sherman tanks, once thought unsuited for jungle warfare, were adapted into mobile assault platforms. They were impervious to most Japanese anti-tank weapons, acting as steel battering rams that could drive right up to a bunker's firing slit and blast it apart. And then there was the weapon that became the ultimate symbol of this brutal form of warfare, the flamethrower. It was a tool of psychological terror, designed to do what high explosives could not: reach into the deep recesses of a cave or the interior of a pillbox and deny the enemy any sanctuary. Each of these weapon systems was formidable on its own. But the true genius of the Marine method was their seamless integration. A single Japanese defensive position might find itself being simultaneously suppressed by naval gunfire, hammered by artillery, blinded by smoke screens, bombed from the air, and assaulted by tanks, flamethrowers, and infantry. The Japanese soldier wasn't just fighting a man with a rifle. He was fighting an entire, interconnected system of annihilation. This overwhelming firepower was the muscle of the American war machine, but its lifeblood was something far less dramatic, yet infinitely more decisive: logistics. Napoleon's old axiom that an army marches on its stomach was raised to an entirely new level in the Pacific. For the Japanese soldier, warfare was a constant struggle against scarcity. Ammunition was strictly rationed. A clean bandage was a luxury, and a hot meal was a distant memory. His rifle was often his only companion, from the day he landed on an island to the day he died. He fought in a state of perpetual want, a condition his warrior code taught him to endure. The American Marine, by contrast, was the beneficiary of the most sophisticated and powerful supply chain the world had ever seen. The sheer volume of material that flowed across the Pacific was staggering. Ammunition was, for all practical purposes, unlimited. Marines were encouraged to use suppressive fire liberally, to pour thousands of rounds into a position simply to keep the enemy's head down. The phrase expendable applied not to the men, but to their bullets. When a rifle magazine ran empty, there was always another one on the belt, and when those were gone, crates more were being unloaded on the beach. This material superiority extended to every aspect of the Marine's existence. He was well fed, receiving rations that provided the thousands of calories needed for sustained combat operations. This was not a minor detail. It was a fundamental advantage. A well-nourished soldier can fight harder, march farther, and think more clearly than one weakened by hunger. More importantly, when a Marine was wounded, a vast and efficient medical system sprang into action. Corpsmen, often under direct fire, administered life-saving aid on the front lines. From there, a wounded man could be evacuated to a field hospital and, if necessary, to a fully equipped hospital ship waiting just offshore. He had a genuine chance of survival, a hope that was almost non-existent for his Japanese counterpart. But the most critical component of this logistical dominance was the replacement pipeline. In the brutal attrition of island warfare, casualties were catastrophically high for both sides. For a Japanese division, however, heavy losses were a fatal blow. There were no replacements coming. A unit bled white on one island was effectively destroyed for the remainder of the war. Japan lacked the shipping and the manpower reserves to reinforce its isolated garrisons. The Americans faced no such constraints. When a Marine division took devastating losses, as they did on Peleliu or Iwo Jima, a steady stream of fresh, well-trained replacements would be funneled in to fill the ranks. Platoons that had been decimated in one assault could be brought back up to strength to lead another the next week. This ability to absorb and recover from staggering casualties was a capability the Japanese simply could not match. It meant that a Marine division could be shattered, rebuilt, and thrown back into the fight, seemingly without end. They were not just fighting an army. They were fighting a hydra, a beast that regrew its heads as fast as they could be cut off. The American industrial and logistical engine provided the tools, but it was the mind of the American Marine that forged them into a superior fighting instrument. On the modern battlefield, victory is often decided in the fleeting moments of chaos and opportunity. It is here, at the small unit level, that the fundamental differences in military philosophy between the Japanese and the Marines became starkly apparent. The Imperial Japanese Army was built upon a rigid, hierarchical command structure. Orders flowed from the top down, from generals to colonels, from captains to lieutenants. This system prized obedience and conformity above all else. While it produced soldiers of incredible discipline, it also created a critical weakness, a lack of initiative at the lowest levels. A Japanese non-commissioned officer, a sergeant or a corporal, was trained to execute orders precisely, not to create them. If his officer was killed, or if the battle unfolded in a way not covered by the original plan, he was often paralyzed by indecision, forced to wait for new instructions that might never come. This rigidity was a fatal flaw when faced with the fluid, unpredictable nature of close-quarters combat. The Marine Corps, in stark contrast, had cultivated a culture of decentralized command. It was an organization that understood that the man on the ground, the one who could see the enemy pillbox with his own eyes, was often in the best position to decide how to destroy it. This philosophy was embodied in the Marine Non-Commissioned Officer, the NCO. Sergeants and corporals in the Marine Corps were not just enforcers of discipline. They were trained and empowered to be tactical leaders. They were expected to think, to adapt, and to seize the initiative without waiting for an order from a lieutenant who might be yards away. pinned down behind a rock. This tactical flexibility gave the Marines a decisive advantage in speed. Imagine a scenario. A Marine squad is advancing when a Japanese machine gun opens up from a hidden cave, pinning them down. In the Japanese system, the defenders would hold their fire discipline and wait for the American officer to expose himself. In the Marine squad, the sergeant doesn't wait. He instantly directs his machine gunner to lay down suppressive fire, sends one fire team on a flanking maneuver, and leads another with grenades in a direct assault. The entire reaction, from the first shot to the destruction of the enemy position, might take only a few minutes. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to a slower, more deliberate pace of battle, would be overwhelmed before their own rigid command structure could even process the new threat and formulate a response. This ability to make rapid, independent decisions at the lowest levels allowed the Marines to exploit opportunities the moment they appeared. They could flow like water around points of strong resistance, probe for weaknesses, and strike with a speed and ferocity that kept the Japanese constantly off balance. The Imperial Army was like a finely crafted but brittle sword, powerful in a planned charge but liable to shatter under unexpected stress. The Marine Corps was more like a club, less elegant perhaps, but brutally effective and adaptable, wielded by 1,000 hands at once. This tactical superiority, this battlefield adaptability, meant that the Americans were not just winning the war of material, they were winning the war of wits, one bloody yard at a time. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new and even more brutal phase. The dream of a decisive Kido Butai-style naval victory that would force a negotiated peace was dead, sunk with the carriers at Midway. The relentless American island-hopping campaign was now a steel juggernaut, closing in on the inner sanctum of the Japanese Empire. Faced with this grim reality, Japanese High Command enacted a chilling strategic shift. The goal was no longer to win battles in the conventional sense. It was to make the cost of American victory so horrifically high that the will of the American people would break. This was the strategy of attrition, a cold and deliberate calculus of blood. The new doctrine dictated that Japanese garrisons on islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would no longer meet the Americans on the beaches in glorious, but ultimately futile, banzai charges. Instead, they were to dig in, to transform their islands into multi-layered fortresses of interlocking caves, tunnels, and concrete pillboxes. Their orders were simple and absolute. They were to hold their positions, exact the maximum number of American casualties for every square foot of ground, and die where they stood. There would be no retreat and no surrender. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant and tragic commander of the Iwo Jima garrison, became the ultimate architect of this strategy. He turned the volcanic island into a masterpiece of defensive engineering, a subterranean fortress with miles of tunnels connecting thousands of mutually supporting defensive positions. His plan was to bleed the Americans white on the black sand beaches and in the labyrinthine terrain of the island's interior. The objective was not to defeat the invasion force, an impossible task, but to inflict 30,000, 40,000, perhaps 50,000 casualties. A loss so staggering, it was hoped, that it would force Washington to reconsider the demand for unconditional surrender. The Americans, it was wagered, for all their industrial might, did not possess the stomach for such a butcher's bill. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it was also a profound misreading of the specific enemy they now faced. The Japanese High Command made a fatal error in their calculations. They applied their attrition strategy against the one American fighting force that was psychologically and doctrinally immune to it. They mistook the Marine Corps for a conventional army. A conventional army, when faced with such a meat grinder, might have recoiled. Its commanders might have paused, questioned the strategic value of the objective versus the human cost, and sought an alternative. The United States Marine Corps, however, operated on a different philosophical plane. For the Marines, the objective was everything. The concept of an acceptable loss ratio was a foreign language. The mission, once assigned, was to be accomplished, a period. The cost was a secondary consideration, a problem to be solved through overwhelming firepower and sheer, bloody-minded determination, not a reason to quit. And so, when the Marines landed on these island fortresses, they did not flinch. They met Japan's strategy of attrition head-on and embraced it. They willingly paid the butcher's bill, in full, and then they raised the price. The clash between Japan's strategy of attrition and the Marines' doctrine of unconditional objective-taking created some of the most hellish battlefields in human history. Iwo Jima, on February 19, 1945, became the ultimate crucible. The fight for this 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock would become the defining moment in the Marine Corps' history and the ultimate symbol of its fighting ethos. From the moment the first waves of landing craft hit the shores, it was clear that this would be unlike any battle fought before. The beaches, composed of soft volcanic ash, were a nightmare. Vehicles bogged down, men struggled to find cover, and Kuribayashi's perfectly sighted artillery and mortars turned the landing zones into a charnel house. In a conventional army, such a disastrous start might have prompted a reevaluation, a temporary withdrawal to allow for a heavier, more prolonged bombardment. But for the Marines, there was only one direction: forward. What followed was a 36-day descent into a primal struggle for survival. The battle was not fought for grand strategic maneuvers across open country. It was a claustrophobic, yard-by-yard brawl fought with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and bayonets against an almost invisible enemy. A single Japanese pillbox, seamlessly integrated into the rocky terrain, could hold up an entire battalion for hours, exacting a dreadful toll until a handful of Marines could crawl close enough to destroy it with a satchel charge. Progress was measured not in miles, but in feet. Companies that went into an attack with over 200 men could be reduced to less than 50 in a single afternoon. Platoons ceased to exist. Their remnants merged with others to form ad hoc units, led by the senior surviving corporal. The casualty rates were beyond comprehension. The battle for Iwo Jima would inflict over 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was the only battle in the entire Pacific War where American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese defenders, who fought to virtually the last man. By any rational standard of military accounting, the Japanese strategy should have worked. They had made the price of the island catastrophically, almost prohibitively high. They had demonstrated to the American command the kind of fanatical resistance they could expect when they invaded the home islands. General Kuribayashi had, in a purely tactical sense, succeeded in his mission. He had bled the Americans on a scale they had never before experienced. But here, the psychological dimension of the conflict proved decisive. The strategy failed because it was aimed at an enemy who refused to be deterred by the cost. The staggering losses did not cause the Marines to falter. Instead, it hardened their resolve. Every fallen comrade became another reason to press the attack, another debt that had to be paid by taking the next ridge, the next bunker, the next cave. The Japanese calculus of attrition was rendered futile because they were facing an opponent who had, in a sense, already factored in the catastrophic cost and accepted it. The Marines were willing to pay any price to take the objective. This terrifying reality, demonstrated in the black sands of Iwo Jima, sent a chilling message to Tokyo. Their last, best strategic hope, to break the American will through bloodshed, was a fantasy. The enemy advancing relentlessly toward their shores was not just an army. It was an indomitable force of nature, and it would not be stopped. The unique and terrifying reputation of the Marine Corps was not solely a product of command decisions or industrial statistics. It was forged in the crucible of a culture that was deliberately and intensely tribal. To become a Marine was to undergo a process of systematic deconstruction and reconstruction. Recruits arriving at Paris Island or San Diego were stripped of their civilian identities. Their hair was shaved, their clothes replaced by uniform, and their sense of individuality relentlessly broken down by the psychological pressure of the drill instructor. This brutal process was not sadism. It was the foundational act of creating a Marine. Its purpose was to erase the concept of I and replace it with we, the platoon, the company, the corps. The individual's survival and comfort became secondary to the success of the group. This intense, shared ordeal created a bond between the men that transcended ordinary friendship. It was a form of brotherhood, cemented by the knowledge that the man to your left and the man to your right had endured the exact same trial and emerged transformed. This bond was the Marine's primary psychological armor in combat. He fought not for abstract ideals like patriotism or democracy, but for the man next to him. To let that man down, to show fear or to fail in his duty, was a fate worse than death. It was this intense loyalty to the immediate group that explained the seemingly superhuman acts of bravery that became commonplace. Marines would charge machine gun nests not out of a thirst for glory, but because the gun was firing on their buddies. They would expose themselves to fire, to drag a wounded comrade to safety, because he was a brother, a member of their tribe. This ethos was perfectly captured in the Marine Corps' informal creed, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. It was a faithfulness not just to the institution, but to each other. This warrior culture stood in stark and shocking contrast to the initial Japanese assessment of the American character. Where they had expected selfish individualists, they found a cohesive unit whose loyalty to one another was as absolute as any samurai's loyalty to his lord. They had expected men motivated by material comfort, and instead found men who would endure the most appalling conditions of filth, hunger, and exhaustion on a desolate rock like Peleliu, sustained by nothing more than the respect of their peers. The Marines had effectively created their own version of Bushido, an American warrior code that was every bit as demanding and self-sacrificial as Japan's. But there was a critical difference. Japanese Bushido was often fatalistic, culminating in a desire for an honorable death in a banzai charge. The Marine ethos was focused, with brutal pragmatism, on victory. It glorified not dying, but making the other man die for his country. It channeled its aggression, its training, and its unbreakable bonds into a single, overriding purpose: taking the objective. This cultural and psychological dimension was the final, critical piece of the puzzle for the Japanese trying to understand their foe. They were not fighting conscripts. They were fighting a secular warrior priesthood, men who had been remade in the image of their institution, and who drew a terrifying strength from their absolute commitment to one another. When a Japanese soldier looked across the battlefield, past the muzzle of his Arisaka rifle, he saw more than just an enemy. He saw the embodiment of a new form of warfare that invalidated centuries of Japanese military tradition. He was witnessing a perfect, horrifying synthesis of the primal warrior and the modern industrial state. This combination was the ultimate source of the dread the Marines inspired. The Japanese soldier could understand the ferocity of a banzai charge. It was a reflection of his own warrior spirit. He could comprehend the power of a battleship. It was a tool of modern war. What he could not psychologically process was a foe who possessed both in equal, terrifying measure. He was facing an enemy who could fight with the sacrificial fury of a samurai in the morning, and then call down the wrath of a steel factory from the sky in the afternoon. This dual nature shattered all of his tactical assumptions. If he tried to engage the Marines in a close-quarters fight, hoping his bayonet skills and warrior spirit would prevail, he found himself facing an opponent just as willing to engage in brutal, hand-to-hand combat, but better fed, physically larger, and armed with a semi-automatic rifle. The Marine was not an effete intellectual. He was a trained brawler. If the Japanese soldier tried to rely on the protection of his fortified bunker, a tactic that would have been effective against a more conventional army, he discovered that the Marines viewed his fortress not as an obstacle, but as a mathematical problem to be solved with explosives. Naval guns would crack the concrete, tanks would suppress the firing slits, and a flamethrower team would deliver the final, horrifying solution. There was no tactic that seemed to work for long. Infiltration at night was met by tripwires, flares, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Massed frontal assaults were consumed by artillery barrages that could be summoned in minutes. A determined defense from a cave system only delayed the inevitable, ending in the searing heat of white phosphorus or a demolition charge that sealed the entrance forever. This constant, multifaceted threat created a sense of utter hopelessness. The Marine represented a complete and total form of war. He attacked from the sea, from the air, and across the land. He attacked with fire, with steel, and with his bare hands. He attacked the body with overwhelming firepower, and he attacked the mind with relentless 24-hour pressure. For the Japanese defender, trapped on a tiny island with no hope of reinforcement or escape, the arrival of the Marines signaled the beginning of the end. It was not a question of if he would die, but how. Would it be in the impersonal, cataclysmic violence of an artillery shell, or in the intimate, terrifying struggle against a man whose face he could see? This feeling of inevitability was perhaps the most potent weapon in the Marine arsenal. They were not just an invading army. They were a force of nature, as inescapable and destructive as a typhoon or a tsunami. And as the war drew closer to the shores of Japan itself, this reputation preceded them, casting a long and terrifying shadow over the defenders who knew that their turn was coming. In the final, desperate months of 1945, the reputation of the U.S. Marine had been fully forged in the fires of the Pacific War. To the Japanese High Command, the Marine was no longer a caricature from a propaganda poster, but a terrifyingly real strategic problem. He represented the utter failure of their entire warfighting philosophy. Their belief in spiritual superiority had been shattered by a foe with an equally unyielding warrior code. Their strategy of attrition had been negated by an enemy willing to pay an unthinkable price in blood. Their own martial traditions of speed and aggression had been outmatched by a force that was faster, more adaptable, and more relentless. The Marine had become the personification of American will. Every island taken, from the malarial swamps of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, was a testament to a national resolve that Tokyo had fatally underestimated. They were the visible, blood-soaked proof that America was not going to tire of the war. They were the guarantee that the demand for unconditional surrender was not a negotiating tactic, but an absolute and non-negotiable reality. This realization had profound strategic consequences. The prospect of facing millions of these same Marines on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu in the invasion of the Japanese homeland was a nightmare that transcended even the horror of the atomic bomb. While the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the ultimate demonstration of America's technological power, the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were the ultimate demonstration of its human resolve. The Japanese military might have been able to convince themselves they could endure the former, but they knew from bitter first-hand experience that they could not survive the latter. To fight the Marines on their own soil would not be a battle. It would be the systematic, grinding annihilation of their entire nation, yard by bloody yard. The Japanese soldier hated fighting the American Marine more than any other unit, not because the Marine was necessarily a better shot or tactically more brilliant in every instance. He hated fighting him because the Marine was a mirror. He reflected back Japan's own warrior ethos, but stripped of its ceremony and fatalism, and replaced with a brutal industrial age pragmatism. The Marine was what the Japanese soldier was told he himself was, a man willing to die for his cause, but he was backed by a nation that could ensure he was better fed, better armed, and better supported in that endeavor than any soldier in history. He was the warrior of the past, fused with the machine of the future. The question that hung in the air of the pillbox before the dawn of invasion was never truly answered. What kind of man willingly sails into a fortress of death? The answer was simply a United States Marine. And for the Japanese Empire, that answer was the final, devastating signal of their utter and complete defeat.